someone on Twitter by the name of @therami, Rami Ismail, published. So I think Activision Blizzard actually just published this, but they this user just what's the word? Microphoned it. They made a post about it. A 25 white page document that includes an amazing A/B test where they secretly progressively turned off skill-based matchmaking and monitored retention, and turns out everyone hated it, with more quitting, less playing, and more negative blowouts. So that's a pretty good summary of the overall thing. But I'll include a link to... I don't know if I include a link to like the document itself, but at least their tweet. Because this is a really fascinating paper. I've kind of skimmed through most of it and done. I haven't done deep reading on the whole thing because a lot of it is just like there's a decent chunk of it dedicated to the specific way that Activision groups players by skill and how they do their calculations and stuff like that, and very fascinating stuff. But just like my eyes glaze over a little bit. I have to focus up the teensiest amount. However, there's some neat, pretty graphs that show off some very interesting information. Basically what they said in the tweet about skill-based matchmaking and people not actually liking it when it's turned off. So, if you don't know, skill-based matchmaking is the idea that the game, an online multiplayer game, has some sort of function, some sort of system for taking your relative level of skill, analyzing your performance, and putting you into a skill bracket, sometimes based off of like your rank or whatever, but also a number of other factors like how you play, your average score. It depends on the game. But it essentially it identifies what kind of skill bracket you belong to, and then it tries to match you into games with people around your relative level of skill. Because the most fun games that people have are close games. People have the most fun when you are playing against people who are either a little bit better or a little bit worse than you, or maybe on your same level. That rough distribution. People like playing people around their same skill level. I'm sure you've had that kind of experience before if you've played a lot of online games. I've had that before. It's when you're playing against, if you're not very good at a game, like I've played a lot of fighting games, and fighting games are filled with there's a lot of fighting games you go play, and it's just really good players who have been, especially if you go play old games, people who will freaking wash you for literal hours. And hey, that's got its own appeal. There's people who can enjoy that. I can get some stuff out of that, right? If I'm really focused on improvement and everything like that. But when you match up against someone who's like about as good as you, oh my god, it is so much fun, dude. It's like some of my best memories of playing the game. So this revealed... Despite how on paper this sounds like a good idea, there has been a surprising pushback against the idea of skill-based matchmaking, specifically from Call of Duty players and probably like Halo players. Now here's the thing. I don't know too much about Call of Duty, but I have learned that I've listened to enough Halo guys in my life to know that I take everything Halo guys say with a grain of salt. Just something about them, I don't entirely trust them to say things and have opinions that make sense. Okay? I'm sorry if you're a Halo player, but that's just the way it is. I'm sorry. Remember, in the Cellarcast system, you're, let's say, lower third. Okay? If you're a Halo guy. So I've always been a little bit wary of that, especially coming from a fighting game background, because most people who play fighting games agree that, like, yeah, no, actually, when you're playing again, if you only get matched against people who are way better than you, over time, that really sucks ass, especially if you're more of a casual player, right? Because there's a wide disparity between people who are complete casuals and competitive players, right? There is I think a lot of people act like you're either one or the other, but in reality, I think most people fall somewhere along a spectrum where either they don't care at all about what's going on, they can have a good time no matter what, or at the most extreme, all they care about is competition and playing better people and improving and getting better and all that jazz. And I think a lot of people fall somewhere between the middle where I feel like this, right? Like I like the feeling of getting better at something, but I'm also like kind of lazy, right? And I don't want to commit hundreds of hours a week or a month to getting better at a video game necessarily when I've already got other shit I want to do and other games I want to play. So I like to invest myself into games to feel like I understand them, to feel like maybe I get a little better, like enough to the point where I feel like I can have fun with the game, right? Because I think a lot of games, there's sort of a sweet spot that might be different per person, but a level of skill that you get where the game starts getting more and more fun, and you feel like you're really playing it and you're digging into something really interesting and stimulating about the game. But there's also like a line, right? There's a line where I really don't want to put in that much effort. And ideally, a skill-based matchmaking system would put you around where your line is, right? Around the point where you find the game fun. Now, that's not counting ranked modes. I think that if you're playing a ranked mode, I think it's fair to say that, okay, you're here for like continuous progression. And if you don't want continuous progression, don't play ranked mode, right? If you don't want to deal with the grind, don't bother. I think that's fair for a developer to say. And if you're complaining about playing better and better people in a ranked mode as you win, shut up. What? That's the point. But different games can have different implementations. So this study has a really interesting, I believe this was in, this is, the example they use is, so they've done tests like this a couple times in the past, as they say. This time it was run in early 2024. They called it the deprioritize skill test, which is really funny. They ran this in Modern Warfare 3, the new one, and it is an A/B test framework. So essentially it's, do you prefer this or do you prefer this? Very simple, just what do you like more? They go through how they define, like, what is skill? They outline all the terminology. They define, like, what is skill? How they calculate it, does it change over time? What is the purpose of tracking it? So they go through all that, and they have a little bit of a graph showing a negative trend, which is essentially, let's see. Let me find the actual quote where this part begins. If low skill players engage with our titles less, then higher and higher skilled players become the new low skilled players, relatively speaking. As a result, they then experience the negative outcomes of being the lowest skilled players in the core multiplayer population, likely resulting in those players then returning at reduced rates. This ultimately becomes a feedback loop, likely resulting in a player population of only the best of the best and a very unwelcoming experience for any new players. Fighting games run into this problem. As this would adversely impact the overall player pool, the net result would be a negative experience for all players. So essentially you have a wide range of people. Once you have a lot of people playing a game, you're going to have, let's say, like a bottom third, a middle third, and then like maybe start chopping it up as you get higher and higher into the top 10% of players, top 5% of players. But if the lowest skill players in that group start leaving over time, let's say you take all those people out, well, suddenly you essentially stretch that out. So you stretch the remaining people out across the population. So the people who were like mid-tier, like pretty good at the game, are now the low-tier players relative to everyone else, right? So now they're the low tiers. They're the low skill players. and then they experience the bad effects, and then they start dropping out. So this is essentially a vicious cycle that starts eating away at a game's population. So skill-based matchmaking is meant to counteract this and ensure that people do not have negative experiences that cause them to quit the game, that they actually enjoy the game. It's funny because it's Call of Duty. So they ran this experiment where they took, what did they say? 50% of players in North America had, they essentially had skill de-emphasized in the matchmaking. So they didn't exactly turn it off. They said that if they had turned it entirely off, the results would have been likely even more extreme. But they loosened it. That's what they say. They say they loosened the skill constraints. And then the other 50% had the regular standard. So they had an unwitting control group. And after 14 days, there is a graph, and it is pretty surprising. So, well, it's interesting. I don't know if it's surprising. So in this graph, essentially what you see is, if you look at like the lower 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So there's like 10 different levels of skill that they've got here. They call them skill buckets. Ooh, my neck. So if you look at the bottom 3, I did some quick math on this. If you look at the bottom 3 skill brackets, let's call them the low skill players, right? The general, like the lower end of the skill floor. In total, they lost 3.75% of them after just a month. Half a month. After half a month. So almost 4% of the lower skilled players dropped off after 14 days. So if you were going to... That's almost 8% in a month. That's actually like a lot, right? That builds up very fast. They even say... So essentially before I even get into their analysis, so at the lowest end, that's where loosening skill-based matchmaking hurts them the most. It gets progressively less so as you get higher in skill, and interestingly, in the top like 10% of players, top 10% skill, they actually saw an increase in players returning. People actually came back more. So the only people who liked it, and that makes a lot of sense to me, the only people who liked that change were the players who were at the very, very top of the pool, which makes sense to me. Because if you've put in that amount of time to grind your skill and your rank and all that, you are probably the kind of person who enjoys playing against very high skilled people and people who are much better than you, because you just have that competitive drive, that kind of desire. But the more and more you trend towards being a casual player, the less you really want that. The more unfun it is for you to have to deal with that. And mind you, this was only after half a month. So again, like that, just by like, let's just assume the trend continues in that direction. That's like 8% of the bottom third of the player base after 1 month. And you start adding that up over time, and what happens, you start to get the vicious cycle that they talked about earlier in the study, in the paper. Interestingly, they also, on the next page, talk about an experiment where they tightened the importance of skill. So they actually made skill more important in the matchmaking algorithm. They emphasized it more than usual, and it actually had the exact opposite effect. So, and I think even more extreme in that sense. It really fascinating. I'd be very curious to see the exact numbers as to how much they increased it. I'd love to like sit down and talk to someone who worked on this. But again, in that bottom third of players, let's see, in the very bottom, like the very, very bottom lowest tier, like skill of player, they had an almost 6% return rate. They had an almost 6% return rate. And then it got progressively lower. So in the very like bottom tier, huge returns. I think like the third lowest skilled had like a 2% return rate. And then it starts to go, interestingly, it forms almost like an inverse bell curve for most of it, where the bottom end benefits a lot, and then it starts dipping down towards the middle, and then towards like the higher end, it picks up a little bit until you get to the top 20%, where you hit the negatives. And the top 10% is severely negative. It was about 4.5% quit rate. They did not want to come back. Negative 4.5%. Which is even more extreme than the gains that were made by loosening the skill requirement. So the interpretation then is that when you only have low-skilled players play with other low-skilled players, they actually really like it, probably because they don't have to give a fuck about how well they play, and they can just be casual players. But when you get really top-tier competitive people, what I think is going on is that it makes them feel like they're plateauing, right? If you are constantly playing someone who's way better than you, and you have that competitive spirit, any victory you get probably feels really good. You're just like eking out the small increases in your skill. But when you're only playing against people who are exactly on your level, you're probably playing with the same people over and over again, so less variety in what you're seeing, in terms of play style, in terms of people and how they behave and react. But you're also not getting the chance to make those little adjustments, those little increases in performance that make you feel better, that are like where you really feel good, of like, okay, I don't know what the fuck it would be for like COD, but that's right. Like that, I think that those small improvements that you get from like really putting yourself in the fire with people who are way, way better than you, that's where those kinds of players get their enjoyment from. And so when you tighten it up, it makes them feel like they're just static and they're staying at the same point. They can't really improve, and they want to improve. So you're not really serving them very well. Those are the two really interesting graphs to me. There's a couple other ones where they go over some other stats. Like, so it wasn't just the quit rate that they tracked. They also tracked things like various different stats, how they were affected. This might be a little more COD specific, but there is an interesting one where they have a statistic for what they call blowouts. So they define a blowout where a blowout is when a team in a lobby wins with a score delta greater than 30. So if there's a difference in score greater than 30 when they win, that is considered a blowout. It wasn't even a close match. It was a total stomp. So when they loosened in what they call the deprioritized skill test, when they loosened the skill factor in the matchmaking algorithm, they saw, I believe that these are differences. Treatment percentage difference. That's what that side of the graph says. The overall rate of blowouts seemed to go up across the board, except for, oh my god, like at the highest, a lot of these are close to like 10% more, which is kind of crazy. And I think very telling, at the very bottom bracket of what they call like the bottom 10% essentially of players, it only goes up by 4%, which is the lowest amount. I would guess that that's just because those people are so bad at the game that a blowout, people are just floundering so much that it's hard for someone to even like completely stomp like that. If you can even do that, you'd probably get floated up to the higher skill tiers anyway. But overall, just really like, oh my god, 10% increase in blowout games. Shit. And that is one of those things that feels like, oh yeah, like you can say that, you can theorize that would happen when you start just matching up anyone with anyone. But wow, seeing the numbers on paper is really fascinating. There is also a kills per minute graph, so that's another stat that they track. Interestingly, this is another really extreme one, because when they loosened the skill requirement, the bottom third of the player base got dramatically worse scores. There was very little change in the kind of mid-range of the player base, and in the top end, the top 10%, 4% increase, which compared to anything else on the graph is big. The bottom 10% had a decrease themselves in 10% on average for what their kills per minute were. So that just kind of falls in line with the blowout graph, to basically imply that when you're matching anyone with anyone, lower skilled players are going to get completely fucking rolled, and higher skilled players are going to be the ones doing the rolling. The last kind of bar graph that they show off, I believe, the last one is kills. What? Oh, score per minute. Whoops, score per minute. And that pretty much says the same thing, because kills are pretty close to score. Match outcome, let's see. Comparing match outcomes between different Call of Duty titles. Okay. Our other opportunity to measure the impact of using skill as a factor in matchmaking is from one game to another in Call of Duty. There's variability in core multiplayer skill, tightness/looseness across titles in the franchise because they tune for skill differently to the other matching criteria. Okay, so basically what they're saying, I believe, is that because, I guess because the CODs are made by different developers, they all control for skill a little bit differently, and so you can use that to compare what are the effects of the different approaches. We compare across games by amalgamating player match outcomes between two different games with different approaches to skill, one tighter, one looser. Match outcome is a broad metric encompassing many factors. Leaderboard placement, regardless of team, interactions with game systems like kill streaks, and interactions with the objective, such as hard points. We can then look at match outcomes between two different games across the skill distribution. So this is a bit more of a complicated graph that they've got here. Essentially, 0.5 placement, low skill matching title, current skill matching title, and hypothetical match skill matching title. Ooh. This is getting a little too mathy for me. Let's see. What do they say about it? In figure 8, which is this graph that it's like a weird spike graph, we can observe the effect of skill grouping on the achieved KD per minute placement percentile. The range of potential outcomes an individual player achieves is widened in the title with tighter skill. In the title with low skill matching, a bottom decile player will place in the bottom half of a team deathmatch close to 90% of the time. In the title with tighter skill, a bottom decile player only experiences this about 75% of the time. So, using skill in matchmaking does not necessarily flatten the outcome graph. It reduces the severity of the slope. A completely flat outcome is included as reference. Okay, so that's what that part of the thing is. Even with more consideration for skill in matchmaking, higher skill players perform better than lower skill players by a significant margin, and still perform far better than they would if skill disparity was the top priority of the Call of Duty matchmaking system, which it is not. So essentially, their conclusions are that basically what every COD player has been denying for years, which is that skill-based matchmaking makes the worse skilled players experience slightly better, to the point where instead of placing well 1 out of 10 games, you'll get it 1 out of 4 games, which is actually a pretty big difference. The difference between 4 games and 10 games is quite large. But it's not so much so that it completely annihilates a better player's ability to win. It just kind of helps out the lower skilled players. So then after that, they jump into like how they actually calculate players' skill and everything, and it's all very fascinating and full of lots of math. It is a very interesting study, and it reminds me a lot of... So the complaint I see with CoD players is that the skill-based matchmaking in CoD, I don't know if this is true or not, or if there's anything scientific to really back this up. If the matchmaking is too sensitive, that you do well like 2 games in a row, and then the game immediately punishes you. Now, that kind of... The game, they say punishes you by immediately putting you like way out of your league instead of a gradual increase in skill of who you're being matched with. So I can believe that the algorithm is not super well tuned, or maybe it doesn't have enough data to accurately put the right players with each other. The fact that there's a new CoD game every year and you're practically starting from scratch every single year, and you don't have a good amount of time to like build up, okay, this is a long time player who's really good at the game. We can use them as a post for how, like, what is a high skilled player to match someone with, right? To create some kind of incline. I can believe that. I have an interesting, I guess, history with skill-based matchmaking, because my first real run-in with it was the first competitive game I ever really played, which was League of Legends. And I kind of despise the game's matchmaking system, and it's one of the biggest reasons that eventually completely turned me off of the game. Because, okay, what I hate about it is that the matchmaking in League, to me, it was pretty clear. This is like pretty common knowledge. I don't know if they've changed it since I stopped playing. I imagine they haven't. It was designed to keep you at an exact 50-50 win rate. Like an exact 50-50 win rate. To the point where it was so obvious to me that I ended up feeling extremely disempowered, like I could have any real effect on the match. When I say that, I mean there are a lot of ways that the system can fuck you over or completely stack the odds in your favor before the game has even begun. Essentially, you can go on too high of a winning streak, and the system will say, uh-oh. It won't say, like, we need to place you with better players. It will literally do things like, uh-oh, we need to handicap you. And they will put you on a team with people who are on losing streaks. Because people on losing streaks are more likely to continue to lose because of mental tilt, and you're having a bad day. They're more likely to be toxic, which just in general makes you more likely to lose the game. Essentially, the game would throw you into situations that they knew were bad to keep you from winning too much, to keep you at a 50-50 win rate, right? And that was like really frustrating to deal with because it made me feel really disempowered as a player. I can understand wanting to keep people around the same skill level, but to do it in such a blatant way, like, dude, it has been a long observation of like, one day you'll just win 10 games in a row and then you won't win any for the next like 2 days because they need to keep you at like the 50-50 win rate. I remember people saying like, hey, it's okay that you lose. Even Faker, the best player in the world, even Faker loses half of his games. And in my mind, I'm like, I don't like that. I don't like that idea. I feel like if you're a really good player, you should be able to hit like at least a 55% win rate or 56% or something, 50 to 60%. I don't know. To me, I feel like if I would prefer that the game gave me enough wiggle room to express my own skill, that I can have a positive win rate as opposed to just breaking even, and that it doesn't bend over backwards to make me to make my performance worse. Maybe not even my performance, but like just my chances of winning worse. I don't like that. I never liked that. And it really disillusioned me, because essentially what it was is it was designing for retention, because the way that the game works in terms of how many points you get per win or loss is that if you have a 50-50 win rate, you will rank up eventually over time. And it's a system that I think is pretty blatantly designed to just keep you playing for longer. And just, I got really sick of it. I got real sick of the way that League of Legends handled its matchmaking. And also, I don't know, there's a number of reasons that I quit. I kind of realized that they weren't making the game for me anymore. Even though I had been playing the game for like 6 or 7 years. I'd given them tons of money in terms of, man, I got over every Christmas, man, I spent way too much Christmas money on Riot points. I was like a consistent player of theirs, and I felt like they were really not going in a direction that I liked, that I didn't agree with. I didn't like the emphasis on like competitive esports shit. I didn't like how team focused the game was. I feel like, I don't want to suck off TF2, but man, they really figured that shit out. They designed a game where one person, it's very difficult in a game of Team Fortress 2 for one person on a team to be the make or break. It is very hard for one single individual to be the reason that you win or lose the game. But that happens in other team-based games, and it's infuriating. And the fact that that doesn't happen in TF2 because the game is not designed in a very snowbally way inherently. There are snowball... It's funny because Payload is such a... You would think of it such a snowbally game mode, and yeah, it technically is. But also, it's only snowbally if, like, people cooperate. And oftentimes that doesn't happen, which is great. The game has like a built-in assumption that you're not going to cooperate with people, and that's kind of when it's the most fun. And those brief moments of cooperation end up just being like these cool little moments. I don't want to get too sidetracked talking about how great of a design TF2 is, and how I feel like every single competitive game should follow its same kind of like core design tenets and philosophies. I've talked about that at length other times. Excuse me. Yeah. Anyway, that's a fascinating study. I will go link it in the description for you to read it.